Julie Pace.
Julie Pace.
Julie Pace.
Julie Pace.
Julie Pace.
I've seen a lot of politicians and dealt with a lot of politicians over the years. And I sometimes think about, what is the thing that makes someone successful in politics? And I think there are two things. One that's sort of in your control, and then one that's sometimes not. And I'll start with the one that's not. Is sometimes there's just a moment, right? And you either hit in the moment or you don't. And that moment might not come back around. I think about somebody like Barack Obama, when a lot of people were saying don't run against Hillary Clinton, and he said this is the moment. And this is actually one of the things his advisors were saying is you don't know if that moment's going to come back again, so you have to go for it. The other bit that I do feel like is more within people's control, the one through line between all of the successful politicians that I have covered is authenticity. They are who they are, right? Good and bad. They know what their brand is. They lean into that brand, and you don't sort of wake up and say, wait a second, like, who are you here, right? And I look at so many other politicians who have just completely flip-flopped, not only on issues, but sort of just on who they are and sort of what they're presenting. And I think the public sees through that. This is one of the lessons of the Trump presidency. I think the public is, at least in the US, is much more forgiving of personal flaws and character flaws and mistakes and missteps if they think that you are authentic.
Welcome to Get Mic'd, the podcast exploring the ins and outs of building a notable brand. I'm your host, Katie Zeppieri, founder and chief brand strategist of the MicDrop agency. In today's episode, I sit down with Julie Pace. Julie serves as the senior vice president and executive editor of the Associated Press, overseeing global news coverage across more than 100 countries. Since taking on this role in 2021, she has led AP to expand its digital news offerings significantly, winning 3 Pulitzer Prizes and producing an award-winning documentary on the Ukraine war that received both an Academy Award and a BAFTA. Prior to her current position, Julie was the Washington bureau chief for AP, where she directed coverage of the presidency, politics, and the U.S. government. Before that, she worked as AP's White House correspondent, delivering incisive news reporting and analysis. Her work earned her the White House Correspondents Association Merriman Smith Award in 2013 for her insightful coverage of the Obama campaign's voter turnout strategy. In this interview, Julie shares with me her rise to leadership at the AP, emphasizing the critical importance of educating people on the role of journalism, especially in today's rapidly changing world. She underscores the vital place of non-partisan journalism during real-world events, highlighting how asking the right questions is crucial for uncovering the truth. Julie also provides an inside look at what it's like to go head-to-head with controversial figures like Donald Trump, showcasing the challenges and responsibilities that come with her position. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Julie, welcome to Get Mic'd.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. You have been a journalist for 2 decades. 17 years of that time has been spent at the Associated Press. I'm curious to know your take on the changes and developments to the role of journalism over that time period.
That's a great question. I mean, there've been so many, and actually, as you were saying that, I was like, 2 decades. That's been a long time. I didn't realize it had been that long. I feel like the newbie still sometimes. I mean, it is. Yeah, I think it's sometimes hard to overstate just how much the media industry has changed. And I think one of the things that is, I think, important to note is like it keeps changing and it keeps changing faster. So it's not just that it's changing; it's that the pace of change, I think, continues to accelerate. And when I joined AP, which was in 2007. In the Washington bureau, we were primarily a text-driven news organization. And now, we really talk about ourselves and pride ourselves on being a digital news organization, which means we don't just think about, do we have video with that story? Do we have photos with that story? Do we have audio? We think about what's the digital audience going to need in terms of packaging all of that content together. And that's a really significant shift for us. And that's just one example of the ways in which a media company has changed. I think the other thing that's really shifted is the expectations of and the habits of the audience. Audiences now have so many different options for how they can access news. And I think we as news organizations are in a kind of constant battle to make sure that we're in the mix there, because it's not just us competing against each other for their attention. It's us competing with TikTok and Instagram and Reddit and any number of other social platforms. And in some ways, I think that's been helpful for us in terms of learning new storytelling techniques. But again, it also creates that real challenge because there are just so many different demands on people for their attention.
And also considering how do you shape and reshape to appeal to, say, Gen Z?
Exactly. And it's one of the things we talk about all the time, because to stay relevant as a news organization, we need to attract new audiences. And, those new audiences have just grown up in a world where they have constant access to information. And I think they also, and again, I don't think this is a bad thing, but I think they also have different expectations of legacy news organizations. They want to know, they don't care that the AP is 178 years old. They don't care, that we have this long history. They want to know right now, how are you relevant to my life? How do I know that I trust you? Tell me now, why it's essential for me to get my information from you. And I think it's forced us, again, in a positive way, to think about, what do we bring to the table that's unique? And how do we pull back the curtain a little bit more and say, it's not just trust this story because it's from the AP. It's, here's what that journalist was doing in the field. Here's the work that went into producing that story. Here's why it's valuable to get information from a journalist, a fact-based independent journalist, as opposed to the number of other places where you can get information on that subject.
I feel like there's almost this educational component that you have to do now, because we're living in a time of misinformation. To your point, we have citizen journalism. We have people just posting about stories, posting their opinions on stories, and there's a war on truth in many ways. What is true, right? Just because we'll see something when we're scrolling on social media or you stumble upon a story, how do you know that that's true? So I'm sure that that's something that the Associated Press has to think about.
It's absolutely something that we think about. And, to the point I was making earlier, I don't think it's something we always thought about in our history. I think there was an assumption, rightly so, that if the AP said it, people assumed it was true, right? Or they expected that they could believe it. And we now know that every bit of fact-based information is going to be challenged, particularly when it's around really difficult, sensitive subjects or very divisive subjects, U.S. politics, the war in the Middle East, the war in Europe, any major significant election around the world. So we have to go above and beyond. And I think your point on journalism education is really essential here. We have to stop assuming that everyone understands the difference between what we're doing and what they might be seeing on other platforms. And I think there's a lot of value. I want to be clear. I think there's a lot of value in citizen journalists, in people having access to platforms that allow them to get their voices out there, particularly people who come from underrepresented communities or maybe don't feel like they've always seen themselves reflected in a lot of traditional media. I think that's great. But I do think that we as independent news organizations need to be able to say, that can exist here, but here's what you get by getting this information from a mainstream, traditional, fact-based news organization. And that does mean, in some ways, again, lifting the curtain a little bit and showing all that goes into doing that kind of journalism, right. All of the resources that it takes, all of the rigor that we put around our process. And every time we've done that, we've gotten a really positive response from our audience. And so to me, it's, lean in more there. And I think, again, it doesn't take away from what we're seeing in other places, but it does allow us to say, this is the value of having these types of news organizations in the ecosystem.
I really like that approach. I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think I've heard you in other interviews talk about just the importance of education and how that shapes people's view when they come across something that you do publish. I'm curious how and when you knew that you wanted to get into journalism in the first place.
It's funny. I have always wanted to be a journalist. I was the editor of my 5th grade newspaper.
Wow.
The Smallwood Elementary School weekly newspaper. It's one of those things I can't tell you exactly when it started. It's just I always wanted to do it. And I think it was just because I'm kind of a nosy person. I like knowing what's going on. I like being able to ask questions of people. Now I can at least claim I do it professionally. It's just my job. But I always wanted to do it. And, it has been the most incredible, career and ride, and the things that you get to see and do and experience and the people you get to talk to. I mean, it's everything I sort of hoped it would be when I was the fifth grade editor of the Smallwood Elementary School newspaper.
And your first role at the Associated Press was a White House correspondent. You then became the Washington bureau chief. So certainly a political angle and focus. Was that something that came naturally to you, wanting to cover politics?
No, not at all. It's actually really funny. I had no intention of ever being a political reporter. When I graduated from college, from journalism school, I tried to make it as a freelance journalist in Southern Africa, and that was my real focus. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I had done a semester in South Africa when I was in school, and the story there really just drew me in, and I found it to be so complex and interesting, and just this opportunity to kind of immerse myself in a completely different culture, and try to explain it, to people. And so I joined the AP in hopes that the AP would send me back to Africa or send me somewhere else as a foreign correspondent. And I thought I would be in Washington for maybe 2 years. And I ended up staying there for 15. And I think, part of the reason I ended up staying is I found that a lot of the things that I had wanted out of being a foreign correspondent, I was actually able to get covering politics. Same thing. I mean, it's an endlessly fascinating, sometimes frustrating story to cover. And you're trying to translate, what's happening in Washington to people, at least when you work for the AP, you're trying to translate what's happening in Washington to people who are not in Washington, right? How do you make what's happening there relevant to their lives? How do you try to explain to them when something that's going on there that seems kind of crazy, right? How do you explain to them, maybe it is kind of crazy, right? And here's why. Or here's, again, what is relevant to your life. And I loved that challenge of, again, trying to be kind of the insider explaining to the outside audience what was happening.
How do you describe what the Associated Press is?
Because
question. I feel like as new generations are coming up, how do you really define the role and the vast reach of AP?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I always say the AP is one of those things you kind of know the AP, but you don't really know the AP. So we're 178 years old, and we operate in 100 countries around the world. And we are, I really believe this, we are one of the very few, certainly at our scale, truly independent news organizations in the world. We're not owned by anybody. We don't have a corporate owner. We don't have a wealthy benefactor. We're not funded by a government. We are truly independent. And our job is to provide journalism to other news organizations around the world. So in some ways, we are really the bedrock of the media industry. Wherever you go in the world, there are news organizations that are getting journalism from the AP, and that's in text, and it's in photos, and it's in video, and it's in audio, and it's data journalism, and on and on and on. We also have our own consumer-facing platform, apnews.com, and that's relatively new for us. And a big reason why we've stepped into that space is because we do feel like what we do is unique. That idea of being a global but independent news organization that's fact-based. We are fiercely nonpartisan. We want to make sure that we are reflecting kind of all sides of a debate, not in a this side says this and this side says this, you decide kind of way, but in a we want people to feel like we're not coming at this with any perspective other than telling you the facts, and where the facts take us is where we will go. So we've stepped into that consumer space, and the reaction has been really positive. I mean, we've seen our audience grow. We've seen our newsletter audience and subscribers grow. We see real interest in the kind of work that we do. And to me, that's heartening. I mean, it's a big challenge, but it's heartening that in this very divisive and partisan climate that we live in the US, but also globally, that there is interest in an independent and nonpartisan outlet. So again, a lot of room to grow there, but we've been excited by what we've done over the last 18 months or so.
Just even hearing you describe AP like that, it feels so refreshing. I think that's why you're seeing such growth.
Well, look, it is one of those things. I'm happy to hear you say that. It is one of those things where, I've been frustrated over the years because, when you do talk to people, they'll say to you, look, I just want the facts, right? Like I want somebody to tell me what's going on, what it means, and not be trying to sway me, not be trying to push me to vote in a certain way, but just like help inform me. And I've always said, hey, we're the AP, we're over here, we're doing that. But to be honest, we've been doing that in ways that haven't always been visible to people because we're putting our news into other platforms. So this was our way to say, we see the need and we're gonna try to answer it. And I think, again, I think it is validating to see that when people say, yes, we do just want fact-based, independent journalism without an agenda, right? I mean, we don't have an agenda other than to inform people and help them understand what's going on in the world. Like people are gravitating toward that. And that is, again, it's fun and challenging, but also really validating.
Walk us through a day in the life for you. And I kind of want to start back a little bit because you've had a remarkable rise in leadership. Like you go from being a correspondent to a bureau chief to now the executive editor of AP. Take us through those different stages and roles. What did sort of like a week in the life look like for you and the rise to leadership within AP?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, my first job in kind of true leadership was as bureau chief in Washington, and it was a really tricky time. It was the first year of the Trump presidency, which really upended Washington in every way, including the media industry. It was incredibly competitive and just nonstop. And so, in that role, I felt like I was, very close to the news, very, hands-on with what we were putting out every day. It was a lot of conversation around standards, a lot of conversation around fact-checking, combating misinformation, and how to do that, again, in ways where you're trying to remain nonpartisan, but also making clear when something is not rooted in fact. And I think we got a lot better. I got a lot better during that time in figuring out that balance. But I'll be honest, that first year was very challenging. It was very challenging. The other thing you learn in leadership, especially when you're managing people, is people management is very difficult. And you have to invest a lot of time in it. And I think for me, my job became, that real balance between the day in, day out of what are we going to do with that tweet? Are we going to do a fact check there? Do we have a live shot over there to, hey, let's sit down and talk about your career, right? Or let's sit down and talk about how you're managing stress, right? In this very difficult environment. So that was a pretty, flat out 4 years there. But again, we got better at it, right? And we figured out systems and we figured out processes to make it work. Now my job is global. And so, I manage teams all over the world. We're in 100 countries, as I said. And, so my days start very early. I'm usually up by 5 and I usually have some kind of call on the books, right? 6 or 6:30, just because my team stretches from, Asia to the West Coast of the United States. And it's just, it's a combination of being engaged on the biggest stories, right? I mean, I'm engaged on the biggest stories that we're doing on any given day. Also, still the people management aspect of it. And I think the other aspect of it is really trying to focus in on AP strategy. Where are we going as a news organization? What are the things we need to be building toward so that we're not just essential now, but really like we're essential in 5 years? And so that involves, on any given day, a meeting about, again, our direct to consumer offering, AI, work we're doing in the philanthropic space with grant partners. So it's kind of that balance between the immediate, what's happening now, and then really trying to think about, where we're going to be in 5 years.
What role does AI play and what role will AI play at AP?
I'm shocked that we've gotten 10 minutes or so and not talked about AI yet. It's the first question I feel like I get asked all the time. So look, the first thing I would say is that we've actually been using AI at the AP for about 10 years. Not the more modern generative AI, of course, that's become more popular over the last year or so, but we've been using automation to do things like automate sports scores and stock tables. And what that has allowed us to do is take the journalists who were doing that work and put them into positions that allow them to do higher value reporting, independent reporting, more deeper analysis, unique work, and to say, we still want to do those basics, but we can automate that and you can go focus over here. And that, I think we have this great track record of showing you can add automation, AI to your newsroom and not have to lay off a bunch of journalists. If you make that choice, right? If you say, I'm going to find another higher value bit of journalism for you to do. And that's what we've done. And so that's the same approach that we're taking right now. So things that we've been experimenting with are Spanish language translation, for example. We have a great translation desk. There's an endless appetite among our customers for more of our content translated into Spanish. Can we use AI to boost the volume of that? Using the tool to do the initial pass on the translation and then having editors come in and do the final edit. Headline prompts. This is something a lot of newsrooms are working on. You know, can you get a tool to prompt you on a headline, again, with a human editor who's gonna do the actual final version of the headline. So there's some of those basics, you know, that we're focusing on right now. There's a lot in terms of just newsroom efficiencies, things that are not public journalism facing, but things like, can we use automation to help do schedules and to help, just with some of our back end processes? That could save a lot of time. Again, so journalists can do journalism. But then there's this whole other category of stuff that, you know, we and others are not using publicly, but I think could be really exciting. You know, things about personalization, right? How do you make it? We talk about, you know, young audiences, right? How do we make it so that when a young news consumer comes to the AP site, they have a very personalized experience, right? Based on what they are interested in, but also on what we think they might be interested in, right? Hey, here's a suggestion for you, or here's how to catch up on the news since you were last here. And that to me is really exciting because it's about how you make the news truly relevant to people. And if you could use automation to do that, I think we as an industry benefit from it. And I should always say with AI, I get the concern over the scary use cases, right? The deep fakes and, the misinformation. But again, if we are focused on how can we validate what's real and what's not, and how do we kind of put ourselves in the center of that, I think, again, we can remain essential, probably even more essential than before.
How much do you think about your own personal brand as a journalist? Was that ever something that you thought about in terms of the stories that you write, how you report, the questions that you ask, all of those components?
Yeah. Yes. And I would say it's changed though, right? So when I was in Washington and I was a reporter, when I was the White House correspondent for the AP, you know, Washington is one of those places where, you know, journalists, not just journalism, but journalists are part of the culture, right? Individual journalists are part of the culture. And so you do spend time thinking about, you know, what is my role, not just what is the AP's role, what is my role? And so I did think a lot about, you know, what did I want people to think about when they thought about Julie Pace? And I wanted to make sure that what they thought about reflected who we were as an organization. And so sometimes there would be a question, you know, in a White House news conference that like maybe I'd want to ask, but I wasn't sure if it actually fit like what I wanted my brand to be and what I wanted the AP's brand to be. Now that I'm in this job, you know, it becomes a lot less about me and a lot more about the organization, right? And I think that's really essential, right? I mean, I am a reflection of the organization. And so, you know, I want to make sure that anytime there is any focus on me, it's really about me amplifying the AP and the work that the AP does. And I think if it becomes too much, and this is the case, I think, in any sort of large company or even small companies, right? If it becomes too much about the person, the individual who's running the company or the news or the newsroom, you're taking away from the brand of your company. So again, I think there's that difference between when you're an individual reporter in certain circumstances, and again, Washington is one of those, versus the role that I'm in now.
I want to talk about the art of the question.
Yeah.
We have a big listener base that are entrepreneurs, and I feel like asking really good questions is an art.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a skill. It's the ability to cut through potentially a bunch of BS. To put it quite bluntly, and really just get to the heart of the matter. And I feel like for entrepreneurs, they'll be using that in so many different conversations, business meetings, opportunities where they need to kind of get the truth or get to the bottom of things. What's your take on good question asking and how to really get to the heart of an issue?
Ideally, you want to go into it knowing something about the person you're asking the question to, because that impacts the way the type of questions you ask, the way you ask them. And I'll give you an example of this. When I covered the Obama White House, I could ask President Obama, and I did many times, a sort of multi-part, three questions embedded in one question. And he would answer it, and he'd go through all of them, right? He would go through it. So I could ask a sort of long, drawn out, kind of complex question, because his style was to give those long answers, so I could throw a lot in there. When I asked Donald Trump questions or interviewed Donald Trump, it was much more a series of short questions with short answers, and that ability to say, okay, I know I'm going to have to interrupt here and get it. Okay, nope, let's focus over here. Nope, I'm going to ask you this now. So it was much more about like the style of the person that I was asking the question to, because I think you always want to think about like what is most important is the answer, right? What's most important is the information that you're eliciting. And so sometimes you have to think about, my style would be to ask the question this way, but if that's not going to work to get the information I need for this person, then you need to modulate, right? You need to adapt to it. So ideally, you want to think about, again, how would the person answer this? Am I giving them an out to avoid half the question, right? Should I actually break that question down into 4 separate questions that I'm going to ask back to back to back as we go through the conversation? But I think being very specific and strategic in terms of how the person is likely to respond is the best bit of advice that I would give there.
Do you have any memorable Q&A that comes to mind? A really good question that you asked and it just elicited this fantastic response. Good or bad?
Good or bad. There was a moment early in the Trump presidency when in a press conference in the East Room, when I asked a question that ended up being one of those questions and answers that got played back just nonstop. CNN called it the Julie Pace question in their production meetings. And I was asking him a question about ties to Russia. And at one point, this gets back to what I was saying earlier. At one point, I had to say to him, because it was a little bit of a back and forth, I had to say like, yes or no, right? Trying to get him down to a yes or no. And it was an impactful moment just in terms of kind of getting him on the record and getting through the sort of spin of to say like yes or no, did you have these ties to Russia? And I thought I might have to do that. I went into the press conference thinking if I got a question, I might have to do that. And I was glad I was able to do it. And again, it became sort of one of those clips that got played over and over again. I don't like it when it's me in it necessarily, but it was an important moment, and I'm glad I was able to do it.
One of the things that the Associated Press is known for is calling the election, the U.S. election. And there's a ton of responsibility that comes with something like that. But take us to an election night. What does that feel like to be on the other side, covering, getting information, calculating, and knowing the results before everybody else?
It's an incredible process that an incredible amount of effort that goes into calling races. We call races up and down the ballot. So we call the presidency and governors and senators and House races, and then all the way down to these local races. It's just this unbelievable feat of journalism, and it involves a lot of expertise. It involves a lot of technical knowledge. It involves a lot of technical support to do it. And it's a tremendous responsibility. We quite simply, we can't get that wrong, right? I mean, we cannot get that wrong. And that's not because of our reputation, though certainly it would impact our reputation if we did. But especially, I think, in the current moment that we're in the United States, it's about democracy, and it's about people's trust in the process, and it's about the integrity of elections. And so, I just can't state enough how seriously we take that and how much work goes into it. And, some race calls are easy and the results are very clear, and some are very stressful, and some you really don't know. I mean, there have been so many moments over the years, most recently, obviously, in the last presidential election where you're looking at the numbers and you're saying, I don't know the way that this is going to go, right? And it's going to come down to this county, and it's going to come down to the absentee vote here and in the mail-in vote, and you really don't know. And the thing I always, want to make sure people understand is we don't have a dog in the fight, right? We are truly following the numbers, right? Where the numbers take us, we will go. That is the only responsibility we feel like we have, is to accurately call the race and to be able to explain to people why we did it. We're not trying to angle for anybody to win, right? And if you look at our track record, you can obviously see whoever wins, we call it, and we call it with speed, because we want to make sure that accurate information is out there as quickly as possible. The one thing that we've really tried to emphasize over the last couple of years, though, is, again, the transparency around those calls. This gets back to what we were saying before. It used to be enough for us to say the AP has declared X candidate the winner. I don't think that's enough anymore. I think we have to say the AP has declared this candidate the winner, and here's why, right? Let's show our work a little bit. Let's help people trust in these race calls by giving them the information they need to understand what's behind the call.
The U.S. election is coming up in November this year. Mm-hmm. What do the next few months look like in terms of preparations at AP?
So it's a lot of preparation around the race calling process. It's a lot of rehearsals. We rehearse, we practice, we feed numbers into our decision desk and have them actually practice calling races. We practice our workflows a lot, our communication a lot, because we want to make sure, again, that what we're putting out to the world gives people trust in it. At the same time, you have all this prep happening over here. At the same time, you start to get the actual campaign ramping up. It's been a weird election year. I've covered a lot of elections. It's been a weird election year in that you have these two candidates in Biden and Trump who are extremely well known. Both have been president. You kind of know what you're getting, right? It's not like you're going to learn something new. I say this a lot, like in our newsroom. It's not like we're going to dig something up, that Joe Biden said as a senator in the 1970s, and it suddenly changes the whole dynamic of the race. It is what it is. And as a result, it's been a bit of a sleepy start to the campaign in terms of the traditional campaign rallies and travel and things like that. But when we get to the conventions, which are this summer, the Republican and Democratic conventions, that really kind of kicks it off. And I think we'll see the candidates travel a lot more. I think we'll see them out there more. And I think the public will start to focus more, because I think there's been a bit of avoidance, I think, from the public in this campaign, in part because they know these two guys so well. But I think we will start to see the public really start to tune in, probably sort of mid to late summer.
And as executive editor on election night upcoming in November, what does it sort of look like? Paint the picture for us, the scene really. Like, I'm imagining headphones and a bunch of different phones going off and, people texting. And what does that really look like? And where are you going to sort of be planted in all of this?
It's very chaotic. I will say we're looking forward to a much more normal election night, because the last presidential election was in the middle of the pandemic, and we were all in person in our Washington bureau wearing masks and face shields and trying to keep 6 feet away. And as the week went on, that 6 feet really started to shrink, and the masks started to become somewhat optional. So we'll be in Washington. That's where we set up our election headquarters, and we have people come in from all over the country, all over the world, really, to help support the operation. And it's from news, and it's from technology, and it's from the business side, our customer engagement teams. It's this really massive team effort, and personally, I find it to be the most fun night in journalism, because there's just such energy around it. My focus will be really on our race calls and how we're explaining them. That's the core of what I will be doing. Really making sure that those race calls, again, are fast and accurate, and that we're able to explain to the public what is happening. And also, the other thing we've talked about a lot is if we get into a situation like we did in the last presidential election, if we can't make a race call for some reason on the night of the election, explaining to people why we haven't been able to, that there's no conspiracy going on, that it's simply the process playing out, and being really ready to go, and being clear and transparent on that front.
You have had a really unique view of politicians, and to me, politicians are such an interesting case study for personal branding.
Yeah.
They're in the spotlight. They're constantly being asked difficult questions. They're putting forward their platform. They're putting forward new ideas of how they want things to be. What would be some of the lessons you've learned in watching and interviewing and studying and reporting on politicians for these 2 decades that would be helpful to perhaps an entrepreneur or somebody thinking about crafting their own personal brand?
It's a good question. It's actually something I've thought about a lot because you're right. I've seen a lot of politicians and dealt with a lot of politicians over the years. And I sometimes think about, what is the thing that makes someone successful in politics, and what is the thing that makes someone, particularly someone who maybe seem to have a lot of potential, because politics is full of people who seem to have a lot of potential and then start to fade out. And I think there are 2 things: one that's sort of in your control, and then one that's sometimes not. And I'll start with the one that's not. Is sometimes there's just a moment, right? And you either hit in the moment or you don't. And that moment might not come back around, And I think about somebody like a Beto O'Rourke, right? Who had a real moment and got very close in Texas to winning a Senate campaign, went on to run for president, and the magic just wasn't there. And he had a moment, right? And if he had won that Senate campaign, his history, U.S. politics could be very different. But he didn't kind of pull it together in that moment. I think about somebody like Barack Obama, who also had a moment in the 2008 campaign when a lot of people were saying, don't run against Hillary Clinton. And he said, this is the moment. And this is actually one of the things his advisors were saying is, you don't know if that moment's going to come back again. So you have to go for it. And I think whether you're in business or whatever kind of industry you're in, if there's an opening, you just don't know when the door is going to open again. You don't know for sure if you're going to be able to walk through that door, but you kind of have to seize it. The other bit that I do feel like is more within people's control, but can become harder, I think, for people sometimes, is the one through line between all of the successful politicians that I have covered is authenticity. They are who they are, right? If you are Donald Trump or you are Barack Obama or anyone else in between, Joe Biden, right? They are who they are, good and bad. And they are okay with that, right? Yes, of course they spin. Yes, of course they're always trying to put their best foot forward, but they know what their brand is. They lean into that brand, and you don't sort of wake up and say, wait a second, like, who are you here, right? And I look at so many other politicians who have just completely flip-flopped, not only on issues, but sort of just on who they are and sort of what they're presenting. And I think the public sees through that. And I think the public is willing to, and I think this is one of the lessons of the Trump presidency. I think the public is, at least in the US, is much more forgiving of personal flaws and character flaws and mistakes and missteps if they think that you are authentic, right? They are just more willing to embrace that as opposed to someone who wants to be super polished all the time. And so I think that authenticity through line is really, I think, the most important bit.
What are some of the goals that you have for the future of AP?
Oh, I have so many. Look, I want, and I think about this a lot, my goal is to ensure that the AP, which is 178 years old, right, remains just as essential going into the future as it has been in the past. And so really trying to make sure that our news report looks like a digital first news report, right? If I leave this job and I can look at our report and say, this is a truly digital first news organization, I'll feel good about what we've done. Trying to make sure that we are helping fill some of the news deserts that we see in the US and trying to make sure that fact-based information is still getting into those communities, even when the business model for it is very challenging, is something that I'm really focused on. Making sure that we are shining a spotlight on parts of the world where very few independent news organizations are operating. I mean, there's a very small, less than 5 news organizations in the world who are on the ground in Gaza and Israel and Ukraine and Russia. All 4 of those places we are on the ground. Making sure that that's something that we can sustain. And really trying to grow our audience, making sure that younger audiences see the value in AP and that we're also adjusting for them, helping give them what they need to be informed citizens, no matter where they live.
That's really exciting. And
yeah, I hope so.
Julie, we're moving into the lightning round portion of our conversation. So I got 5 quick questions for you to get some actionable takeaways for the audience. First up, complete this sentence. To me, building a notable brand means
being authentic.
What has been a memorable mic drop moment in your own career?
I don't know if this is quite a mic drop moment, but I was really proud. The first big story that I ever was like the lead reporter on was the night that the U.S. Killed Osama bin Laden. I was kind of on my own on a Sunday night at the White House, and I was so intimidated and not sure if I was going to be able to do it. And I did it, and I was really proud of that. And it still stands out as one of the most fun and interesting and challenging moments of my career.
What's one brand you admire and why?
Okay, this is going to maybe be kind of cheesy, but I genuinely mean it. I really admire Taylor Swift as a brand, and the way that she has owned her brand fully, and become not just, a musician who everybody knows, but a real business powerhouse and taking control of a lot of things that I think a lot of other artists haven't done before. And I think there are so many lessons in just kind of taking control of your own brand there.
What are a handful of resources you'd recommend to someone who's looking to build their personal or company brand?
It's a really good question. Look, I spend a lot of time, on my early weekend mornings reading just a range of different, business sites and news sites. I think there are great things in Harvard Business Review. I think there are great things in, editorial pages of a whole, host of different news organizations. I try to have a kind of a global mix. And then I would say just find the brands you admire, right? Find the brands you admire and figure out what is the thing that you admire about them. And sometimes you can just ask people. I mean, I've done this before too. Sometimes people, maybe Taylor Swift's not going to answer my email, right? To say, how did you build your personal brand? But you'd be surprised, the number of people, if you say, hey, I really admire this about you, I'd love to have a conversation. Sometimes people just respond. And I've done that myself, and I've responded to other people as well. So I think not being afraid to sort of tap brands you admire as the resource.
I like that a lot. What's up and coming for you, Julie, and where can people connect with you?
Well, what's immediately up and coming, and I know this will be over by the time this airs, is I'm going to Collision, the big tech conference in Toronto, to talk about U.S. elections, and then a couple other big things that are coming up for me. We have the Olympics at the AP, which is a huge endeavor for us. So I'll be in Paris with our team there. And then it's really the lead up to the U.S. election. That's going to be so much of my focus. You can connect with me on a range of social platforms. Though I will say I am less engaged on social as I used to be, but I'm on X and Instagram and Facebook for those who are still on Facebook, and try to dabble in all the other new things that are popping up. But follow the AP accounts; they're really great. Our Instagram and our TikTok accounts in particular are pretty fun these days.
Julie, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in to Get Mic'd. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. I look forward to bringing you more engaging conversations with thought leaders, sharing their insights on building a notable brand.